everybody. We're going to try something new today. I'm going to read from you from the book so you can see some of the pictures. I'm not looking real pretty tonight, and I didn't want to disappoint anybody. I know that I didn't post yesterday, and so I wanted to make sure that I posted today, but I really didn't want to see what I look like today. So we're going to go ahead and get started. This is what's called the funny walking stick. So you don't even need your book tonight, if those of you that are following along, because you can follow along in the video. Okay, so the funny walking stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took a walking stick downstairs to his work shed. There he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small, the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly so that the extra bits looked like part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very, very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly, you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "There's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. "Well, what could have happened?" Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. "It must suddenly have grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick, it's you," said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. "It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now." "Oh, that's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're shrinking, woman," said Mr. Twit. "Oh, it's not possible." "Oh, yes, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never!" she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you shrunk in comparison. You got the shrinks. That's what you got. You got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly, she had to sit down. Mrs. Twit has the shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair and you shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he had been with the walking stick. Every night when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, He had done the same to the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried. "And you shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You got them badly. You got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end there's nothing left except for a pair of old shoes, a bundle of old clothes." "Oh, I can't bear it," cried Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit, "the worst in the world." "Oh, how long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I'd say, no more than 10 or 11 days. "Oh, but isn't there anything we can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr. Twit. "Tell me," she cried. "Oh, tell me quickly." "We'll have to worry," said Mr. Twit. "I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. "Oh, what is it I must do?" cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit. And there we go. Boys and girls, we will leave it there. And then we will get back, hopefully tomorrow, and finish up our chapter. So I hope everybody is enjoying their lovely weekend, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Bye, guys.